Welcome, everyone. My name's Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Transportations of Terror and Trauma and features Dr. Marcus Rediker, author of The Last Slave Ship, A Human History, and Dr. Sarah Federman, author of Last Train to Auschwitz. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. This event is part of the 2024-25 KHC and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Circuitous Exchanges. The event is co-sponsored by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University. After the presentation, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your screen. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows, Dr. Danny Sexton. Dr. Sexton is Associate Professor in the English Department at Queensborough Community College, and he's published on Victorian African American literature, as well as on issues of race, gender, masculinity, and pedagogy. He's currently working on a book about the literary representation of all Black towns and communities. Dr. Sexton, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, and I'd like to thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this event. As noted in the description, New World slavery and the Holocaust were dependent upon the use of transportation systems, ships in terms of slavery and trains in terms of the Holocaust, to transport people to forced labor and death. Our focus is on the interconnected roles these systems play in our memory of these atrocities. While our presenters will be discussing both slavery and the Holocaust, we wish to point out that there are differences and similarities that we should be aware of. Among the differences is the purposes and the duration of these atrocities. The similarities are the participation of corporate entities and the traumatic effects that these events have left upon numerous participants. We also want to emphasize that we are not interested in a comparative study of suffering, arguing which group had it worse. Those types of discussion only serve to sow discord, which are not beneficial in helping us understand these human tragedies. And despite the emphasis on tragedy and trauma associated with these experiences, we also want to look at those moments of resistance and perseverance. Let me now introduce our two speakers for whom we are exceptionally grateful that they accepted our invitation to speak on this important topic. Marcus Rediker is a distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh. His History from Below have won numerous awards and has been translated into 19 languages worldwide. He has over the years been active in a variety of social justice and peace movements, including the worldwide campaign to abolish the death penalty. He's the author of 15 books, including The Many-Headed Hydrant with Peter Lindbaum and The Slave Ship, A Human History, which won the George Washington Book Prize. He produced a prize-winning documentary film, The Ghost of Amistad, directed by Tony Buba, and co-wrote a prize-winning play, The Return of Benjamin Lay, with Naomi Wallace. His latest book, Freedom Ship, The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea, will be published by Viking Penguin in May 2025. Sarah Federman is an associate professor of conflict resolution at the University of San Diego's Clark School of Peace Studies, where she studies the intersection of business and mass atrocity. Federman comes to this work after a decade as an international advertising executive working in over 10 countries with companies such as Google, Discovery, and the NFL. A job transfer from Manhattan to Paris led her to an encounter with her own name on a Holocaust memorial wall. It was this moment that prompted her to turn her attention to helping people avoid mass violence, focusing specifically on corporate complicity. She is the author of the award-winning Transformative Negotiations, Strategies for Everyday Change and Equitable Futures, University of California Press, 2023, and the award-winning Last Train to Auschwitz, The French National Railways, and The Journey to Accountability, University of Wisconsin, 2021. Today, Dr. Rediker will present first, followed by Dr. Federman. So I now hand the floor over to Dr. Rediker.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm happy to speak to you today about this issue of transportations of terror and trauma based on a book that I published in 2007 called The Slave Ship, A Human History. So let me begin by giving you some basic information. The Atlantic slave trade, which began roughly in 1501 and ended almost 400 years later in 1867, transported, or let me put it this way, loaded onto slaving vessels some 12 to 15 million people in West Africa to transport them to the plantations of the Americas, North America, the United States, the Caribbean, Brazil, Central America. There were plantation societies in many of these areas. About 9 million people were delivered alive to these destinations, and you'll see that the discrepancy between those loaded on the ships and those taken off the ships is several million, but that actually understates the mass death because millions more died in Africa before they ever boarded the ships, and many hundreds of thousands died in the Americas soon after they arrived. They were in such poor health. So the slave ship, it's a gruesome topic. It was itself a floating prison in which on every voyage, several hundred people, several hundred Africans of 10 to 15 different ethnicities and nationalities were loaded onto the ship and then literally jammed down into a small, crowded, poorly ventilated space called the lower deck of the vessel. This was their prison, this lower deck. The conditions on the lower deck are so horrific as to defy rational explanation. But here's one anecdote that I heard, which I think can help you to understand how horrible that situation was. In Charleston, South Carolina, where a large number of these slaving vessels went to unload the captives, it was said, when you stood on the docks, it was said that that you could actually smell a slave ship before you could see it. In other words, the stench from the unsanitary conditions bred in the lower deck by having hundreds of people jammed in there was so powerful. Actually, slave ships were known for this. They were known for the human stench, which expressed not only sickness and disease, but terror because of the way the human body creates pungent smells under extreme conditions of fear. The British abolitionist William Wilberforce put it this way. He said, "Never was so much human misery concentrated into so small a space as aboard a slave ship. Now, my first argument to you is that the slave ship is itself a big instrument of terror. In other words, it was designed to be terrifying to the people who were going to be shipped on it. It was made up of smaller instruments of terror, whips, the cat o' nine tails, which was famously the most important instrument of authority possessed by a slave ship captain, guns, shackles, manacles, neck rings, chains, and even the dreaded speculum oris, an instrument that was used whenever the enslaved refused to eat, their mouths and throats would be forcibly opened with the speculum oris so that some kind of gruel could be poured down their throats in order to keep them alive for arriving in America to labor on these plantations. So the slave ship is really, I don't know how better to describe it than as a chamber of horrors. It had its own logic, a bloody logic, a deadly logic. It was one part warship. It featured cannons in order to fight off other European vessels that might like to steal the enslaved people and carry them to their colonies in the New World. So one part warship, one part prison, and one part factory. Now, this might be surprising to you because you don't often think of a ship as a factory, but it was very much a factory. In truth, the word factor, which meant originally a merchant, especially a merchant on the west coast of Africa, would conduct his business on board a slave ship, which would then be called a factory. Okay, so what did the factory produce? The factory that was the slave ship produced two principal items. First of all, it produced the labor power of millions of people who would power the plantation system. Okay, and as such, in helping to create that labor power, this was central to the rise of capitalism as a new social and economic system. That's the first thing the slave ship produced. The second thing was that the slave ship produced categories of race. And let me explain what I mean by that. A group of sailors who might begin the voyage in a port like Liverpool, or it could be Nantes in France, or it could be Bristol, Rhode Island, would board the ship, and they were described as a motley crew. They were multi-ethnic and multinational. The slave ship created race for them because by the time they arrived on the coast of West Africa, they were known as the white people. Not because of their skin color, because there were people of many skin colors in this motley crew, including some Africans who couldn't find any other kind of work. And they achieved that label of whiteness because they were in control of this factory, this machine called the slave ship. And it's quite interesting that a parallel thing happened among the multi-ethnic Africans who were forced aboard these slave ships. As I said, 10, 15, 20 different ethnic groups. The slaving captains would go from port to port to get people of different language groups so they could not cooperate in resistance. But when these multi-ethnic Africans were unloaded to the ports of the Americas, they were unloaded as members of a single common race. Okay, the Black race, the Negro race, the African race. So you can see here that the slave ship actually created the category of race, helped to create it. Now, even though the goal of merchants and slave ship captains was to keep Africans alive so that they could labor and produce wealth on New World plantations, mass death was nonetheless a major part of the experience of the Middle Passage. That's the voyage from West Africa to the receiving port in the Americas. It might be from what is presently Nigeria to Virginia, or it might be from Sierra Leone to Barbados. Okay, that's the Middle Passage. And one way I would illustrate the terror of constant death is that every morning the captain would order the sailors to go down to the lower deck and bring up the corpses of those who had died. And practically every ship, every night, witnessed this kind of death, highly public, in a very crowded space. Those bodies would be brought up on deck and unceremoniously thrown over the rails of the ship to these schools of sharks that would follow these vessels all the way across the Atlantic, feeding on the human bodies that were thrown over every morning. So the slave ship is a place of extreme violence, a place of extreme terror. You could go so far as to say torture, certainly a great deal of trauma. But I want to emphasize to you that it was also a place of resistance. And I must say, in writing this book, The Slave Ship, what I learned about human resistance under those most extreme circumstances was the most powerful and redeeming part of the whole story. The simple truth is that the enslaved, in their millions, refused to accept this new status imposed upon them as property. They simply rejected it, and they fought it in every conceivable way. One thing I've said about the slave trade is that it was a 400-year hunger strike. Refusing to eat is one of the relatively few things that the enslaved could do. Now, I've already mentioned the speculum oris, try to keep people alive. But the truth is that some people, when they refused to eat, they succeeded in dying. This was a kind of a suicidal thing, but they accepted that. They also resisted through other kinds of suicide. For example, in some instances, mass suicides of people jumping over the side of the ship, knowing fully well that they were going to die, knowing that they would probably be eaten alive by sharks, but fueled by a religious belief that if they died under such circumstances, their souls would go home to Africa. And slave ship captains were very conscious of this. And one of the things they tried to do to prevent it was they put up nettings all around the railings of the ship to prevent people from jumping overboard. So that's a second kind of resistance. A third was insurrection, rising up on board the ship. Now, it turns out that for many, many years, decades, we had a false picture of how common these insurrections were. It turned out that they happened on a huge number of ships with significant loss of life. So people rose up and fought. They didn't have any weapons. They'd pick up tools on the deck of the ship to fight back against the guns, almost like machine guns rained down on them. So they fought. And the fourth thing they did, which I think is in some ways the most moving and powerful of all, they built what anthropologists call systems of fictive kinship. In other words, they began calling each other brother and sister and uncle and aunt. And this is among people who were not biologically related to each other. They had come from different groups, different regions. The kinship that was the basis of their society was shattered by the process of enslavement. So they are actually building community, inventing new kinds of language and song and dance under these most extreme conditions on the lower deck of a slave ship. And I find that just unbelievably powerful and very moving. So here's one of my last points to you. The slave trade is not over. The slave ships are still sailing. It's like a ghost ship on the edge of our modern consciousness because we live with the consequences of these slave ships every single day of our lives. slave trade and slavery, this powerful institution of slavery, live on through discrimination, through intergenerational poverty, through deep structural inequality, and through premature death. We still live with all those. Now, I am personally in favor of reparations for the slave trade. I would ask you to note that the root word is repair. The deep and persistent damage of this historical process remains with us. We've still got to do something about it if we have hopes of a more just and fair and equitable future. And then we come to the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for all of this? Well, a great many corporations, especially in banking, are responsible. A lot of the banks that we know today had their origins in or very significant capital investments from slave traders. Okay, that's the first point. A second point is another group that is highly responsible for this is the American government, which sanctioned slavery at every moment from the beginning of American history up through the Civil War. I would remind you that the plantation system created the greatest accumulation of wealth the world had ever seen up to that point. And we also know that its profits fueled the next massive accumulation of wealth through the Industrial Revolution. So society as a whole benefited from this wealth. The American government depended on this wealth, and it didn't really come to an end even with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. New forms of racial exploitation were devised to keep that system continuous. Now, I'll just mention one thing toward our discussion. I do think there is a direct line from the slave ship to the trains that carried people to the concentration camps. And that is the racial ideology, which in some ways began with the slave trade and fueled a lot of the Nazi assumptions about Jews in the 1930s and 1940s. So we move from the slave ship and its regime of terror to eugenics, racial eugenics, and industrialized slaughter by the Nazis. Both of them, in my view, are revealing moments in the history of capitalism. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. That was so powerful. I'm still completely with you on those ships. So, and thank you for the transition to the train. So I'll do it so we can hear from everybody else as we go. All right. So as was mentioned, what brought me to this topic about trains and the Holocaust, I did not expect this. I had an advertising career. I was living in Paris, but then I saw my name on this Holocaust memorial wall. And that reminded me of something that my history professor had asked me when I got to France. We were still friends from college. And he said, find out if those train drivers kept their jobs after the war. And seeing my own name made me want to answer that question. And I wanted to know, what role did the French National Railways play in the Holocaust? And that's the SNCF. If those of you who've been to France will recognize this train company. And what does it have to do to atone today, if there's that question? Just for those, it's really interesting about the trains in France. Of course, France didn't start World War II, so it might be an interesting company to pick. Like, why are we talking about the French trains and not the German trains? And we can go into that. But one thing that's interesting about the railways in France is how much a part of the French identity railways are. One of the survivors had said to me when I started this research, like, be careful because you're going after French identity when you start asking questions about the railway. The French National Railways was consolidated as one rail company right before World War II, right before the Germans invaded. So that was very convenient for them to have it. Otherwise, it was independent lines, the way the US had independent lines before it was consolidated under Amtrak. So just a little bit about how I went about this research. because those of you who are researchers, it's sometimes fun to hear. I did all the archival work I could. Anywhere there was anything written about the role of the French railways in World War II, I sought it out. Then I spoke with executives, Jewish leaders, Holocaust activists in France to find out what they thought about the railway role, what they knew about it, and what ought to be done. And then I ended up speaking to 90 survivors who fled persecution in France. So what I'm going to share with you today is a kind of a mix of all of that. And what I found, which was, I think, important as we look at corporate atonement and accountability going forward, is that the SNCF had many roles in World War II. It had 500,000 employees. That's more than all US airlines combined. Amtrak, to give you a sense, only has 17,000 employees. So briefly, we're going to focus on the villain role, but I want to just kind of put it in context. The SNCF saw itself as a victim in World War II because it didn't ask the Germans to come in and requisition the railways, which it did. When France fell to Germany, it was under German rule. So about 6,000 German engineers were directing the 500,000 SNCF workers. And it wasn't a great time for them. Hugo Boss did very well in World War II because he made Nazi uniforms. The SNCF, in comparison, suffered a lot of losses. The Germans never paid what they said they would to use the railways. A number of their workers were sent off as forced labor. And of course, some were killed in that process. The SNCF also had a heroic role, although not the company, but there are a few workers who actually did. They assisted with escapes of the deportees and political prisoners. So there were a lot of people transported on these trains. They coordinated with the resistance. There was no resistance within the SNCF. And then some people helped sabotage trains on D-Day. But the one that we're focused on today with the terror and trauma is the one related to the Holocaust. So yes, while it's true that some SNCF workers were sabotaging trains filled with German armaments on the way to D-Day, the Normandy beaches, there were also trains heading east to the camps. So the SNCF did help transport 76,000 deportees, and they were not traveling in third class passenger rail. They were, of course, in what we now call cattle cars. And you can see, the SNCF's name in the corner of this. And many of the survivors of those trains, no one survived the gas chambers in World War II, like in the death camps, but some did survive the train. So we got to hear what that experience was like. It really represented the end of their identities, right? They get on those trains. They weren't sure where they were going, but there was no light, very little air, no sanitation. Their belongings were taken from them, and it really was the end. And the conversations that were on those trains were quite harrowing. Some remember the thirst as actually even being worse than Auschwitz itself. So they were in horrific conditions that obviously the rail company knew about because they were driving those trains. Oh, excuse me. And what became important, with trains in the Holocaust, like ships for the transatlantic slave trade, is Raoul Hilberg, who's known as one of the fathers of Holocaust research, said, the Holocaust couldn't have happened without trains. Almost everybody who arrived at one of the 50,000 camps arrived by train. Some were by trucks, but really most by train. And just to give you a sense of the enormity of the railway participation, there were 42 parallel tracks at Auschwitz. So just Auschwitz alone had 42 parallel tracks. So to make the Holocaust happen, it required not just the German railways, but also the Hungarian, the Dutch, the French, and so on. So it was all of the railways that the Germans would then requisition and then use throughout Europe to move all of these deportees to the various camps. What's so poignant for trains and the Holocaust is this idea of les lieux de mémoire, sites of memory, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And that plays an important role in how we understand the role of this particular transport. At first, which is very interesting, the railways in France right after World War II were actually sites of pride. So as a lieu de mémoire of resistance, there is a film you can watch on YouTube. It's in French, but you can get the idea. This was produced in 1947. It was released, and it was written in conjunction with the French government and the SNCF to focus on the French railway as a site of heroism. The French were so demoralized after the years of occupation that the government wanted some way to get them to focus on some good or some heroic role. And film focuses on those few railway workers who resisted on D-Day and helped sabotage those trains, which allowed the Allies to secure their landing. So that's a memory site that was the heroic. And of course, those railway workers who sabotaged those trains were doing so at the great discouragement of the executives of the company. So I just want to be clear that the company didn't resist, but a few workers did within the company. The SNCF even received the Légion d'honneur, the highest medal of honor in France, for its role in the resistance. This is sort of a shoddy photograph because I took it in their headquarters. This is actually a medal that they have on display because they're very proud of the role of the resistance. And again, the company didn't resist, but there were some workers who did. That lasted as the SNCF, as a memory site of pride for World War II, lasted until the Soviet Union fell, because that's when a lot of unfinished Holocaust business emerged. The West no longer needed Germany and Switzerland to protect it from the Soviet Union. So then there was, that's when all of those lawsuits, or information about like IBM's role, the Swiss banks, all that money that came out, back the ill-gotten gains. So this all happened in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. So then we start to see railways articulated as sites of terror and shame having to do with the Holocaust. And this is when this strongly emerges in the 90s. Related to the SNCF, there were lots of lawsuits related to other companies, but in France, this happened as well. This is Kurt Schuechter on the top, who snuck into Toulouse archives and found documents showing the SNCF was paid for some transports within France. He just sued the railway for €1 symbolic because he wanted the company to acknowledge that it did have this role. It was not simply a hero in World War II. The company put up a plaque where his father was deported, and he dropped the lawsuit. But Alain Lipietz, who's shown below, did not drop his lawsuit. He actually sued the company and almost won for the deportation of his father. Now, in France, there's no class action lawsuits. So everybody who wanted to sue the SNCF for these deportations had to do so one at a time and at their own expense. The SNCF did respond in the 90s, because also these executives, they didn't even know the history necessarily, because they too had been raised in this culture of it's a memory site of heroism. So the company opened its archives. It actually commissioned an independent study, which it made public. They revised their history. They contributed to Holocaust commemoration and made an apology. So we see this actually with a lot of corporate reparations, actually institutional reparations. Even universities that had a role in slavery tend to follow these steps as well. But they did not pay survivors. They did everything but. They said, listen, we're a national company, so if you want reparations, you got to talk to France, right? Don't make us pay. But what the shift happened is, as all of these people started to share their stories, because now there was space to talk about their journey, we start to see what actually happened on the rail. And again, it sort of was like a pre-gas chamber, because again, nobody escaped the gas chamber, but they did. Some of them did escape the railway. One of whom was escaped is Leo Brechtholz. He's got this book, if you want to read. He actually escaped the Nazis like 7 times. It's an incredible story. And one of the times he actually jumped out of a rail car headed to Auschwitz. He was in France. So his outstanding book talks about some of the conversations that were had on those railways. I include some in my book that I found from people who had survived as well. And again, I was focused predominantly on France. What ended up happening is now railway cars and railway tracks are the symbol of the Holocaust. No good Holocaust museum lacks either a railway or a rail car. On this one, that's actually a photo of Kansas City. The in Johannesburg, they surveyed Holocaust survivors and Jews for their Holocaust museum and said, what symbol does the museum have to have? And they all said railways. So now they have tracks going up into eternity. So it's a moving lieu de mémoire. It's a moving memory site to this day. And I want to just point out that during World War II, it wasn't just deportees, right, who were being transported along against their will. In the United States, we had the Japanese internment camps. So they were not put in the horrific conditions that the Jewish people and other political prisoners were during World War II, but they were transported against their will. You don't hear anything about the U.S. railway and accountability because Amtrak was not created until 1970, and these actual railway companies don't exist anymore as entities. So they've sort of escaped that accountability conversation. But just to be clear that, like, we've been here before, that the U.S. did participate in some ways. What happened with those those lawsuits in France? Because as I mentioned, the individuals were having to sue the company one at a time and actually pay those fees themselves. And eventually the French courts said, this is the Conseil d'État, which is the High Court of France, said, I'm sorry, no more World War II related lawsuits. Like, it's an administrative nightmare. We've done the best we can with reparations, so no more. You can't bring any more cases against the SNCF or anyone related to World War II. This happened in about 2013, 2014. I can get the exact date. But, they tried to stop the past and tried to stop this conversation, but history it's very resistant to being put away forever. So now the lawsuits moved to the United States, and Harriet Tayman was a lawyer who helped launch this lawsuit against the SNCF, representing, she claimed, 600 survivors. But you can't sue France because the SNCF is considered a national company. She knew that, of course, but she was using the lawsuit to get attention, and she really did. She got articles in Washington Post, Atlantic, Le Monde, using the phrase that people were being charged, that the company charged per head per kilometer. So that gruesome image gained a lot of traction for this debate. The SNCF actually bids for contracts in the United States. It bid for contracts in California and Florida and Maryland, New York, and there was legislation launched against them until they atoned for its role in the Holocaust. Only Maryland passed the legislation, but that's Leo Breatholtz. He's the one who jumped out of that rail car as a young man. And Maryland said, you have to digitize your archives before you can bid for any contracts. So that seemed like a win for the survivors until the Purple Line contract. So this is a new line of the DC Metro. Some of you may be familiar with it. I'm not sure it's done yet. But the SNCF bid for this hybrid Maryland DC project. And this time, Holocaust survivors actually wanted reparations, not just transparency. And this escalated the conflict to a whole other level because now you have Maryland residents asking for reparations from the French state. So we got Maryland Senate involved, you had the House of Representatives, you had the Department of State, and then you had the French and US ambassadors negotiating this out. And France agrees to pay $60 million. This was in 2016 to compensate some of the survivors. But I just want to be clear that all the survivors who had different opinions about atonement for the SNCF's role in their terror. I mean, Rosette Goldstein, she just never wants to see the SNCF in her state. She's in Florida. She said they never lifted a finger. She doesn't want them. Leo, who you saw, he's the one who jumped out of the rail car. He was in Maryland. He wanted transparency, apology, and compensation. But here's Manfred. He was like, why are we doing this? This isn't even the same people. Like, I don't want to punish the young French people today for what their parents did. And this is Daniel Urschbettel, who was deported to Auschwitz. And he said, I'm sorry, like, you can't hold them accountable because I also had to do things under constraint. So I just want to say it is interesting to see how much diversity in opinion among survivors there was. But now today we're at a moment where these survivors and almost everybody I interviewed has died, kind of leaving behind their story and their wisdom on this. Here, with the yellow tie on the left and the white hair with the glasses, that's Harry Markowitz. And he always said, he would tell me, like, it could have happened anywhere. I mean, it happened in France and it happened in Europe, but he believed that if the conditions are right, it could happen. And it could have happened in the United States. One of the things I've been doing is trying to reclaim trains as sites of connection and joy. I just took 11 students across the United States in a course called Crossing the Divide, and we used Amtrak to go from San Diego to DC and study different conflicts around the country and talk to strangers. So trying to bring joy back from where there was terror. But we're also facing a moment when we're going to likely see some mass deportations again. And if the Trump administration follows through and uses the US military, there's going to be a question of what kind of transport they will use. Last Trump administration, some of the US airlines actually refused to fly the planes that were going to separate families, but we'll see if it's the US military. So one of the questions before us, what I'm thinking about in this theme, going from slavery to the Holocaust, is what transport would be used for this mass deportation and how will they be remembered for their role? Thank you. If you want to ask me, I just put my website up because if you wanted to send me an email through that, if you want to know more about the train class or any aspect of this I didn't get to, I'm happy to chat with you. We have a little movie out about the train class, which is great.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much, Marcus. I want to turn it over to Danny.
Hello, Marcus. Hello, Sarah. Thank you once again for that. I guess, Laura, do we have any questions or anything from any of our attendees or?
Not yet, but
Okay.
for those of you that are online watching us, please be sure to submit your questions, and there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, so I have a few, and I guess maybe the thing is just kind of like to open up a dialogue between Marcus and Sarah because I saw so many other connections here that I wasn't even thinking about when we, decided to do this presentation. And one of the things that I was very interested in is this whole notion of reparation. And I know, Sarah, you spoke quite a bit about it in your presentation. Marcus, you alluded to it as well. And I guess one of those questions would be, I guess this is kind of geared towards you, Marcus, more so than Sarah, because Sarah, I think you kind of answered this, but what would that look like in terms of the slave ships and things of that nature? Because I know Sarah gave like all these different like complexities of or responses, right? So Marcus, have you given that any further thought of what that would look like in terms of reparations?
Danny, I don't intend to dodge the question, but I don't think it's my job to say what reparations should be. My view is that these kinds of demands need to be made by the people who were most directly affected by this horrific history, and that needs to come from below. So
Thank you.
I do know through the work of Sandy Darity at Duke University and others, there are a great many different and very creative plans for reparations, that this need not be a simple matter of money, that there are other ways to overcome problems. For example, a kind of Marshall Plan for the poorest parts of American cities. This would be a tremendously valuable thing that would benefit the entire society, but specifically help people to overcome the highly structured disadvantages that they have always faced in the inner city. So I think what we need most of all is the political will to overcome these horrors in the past. I don't see it in a widespread fashion right now, but I'm hopeful that we might get there. Probably not in the next few years.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm working on a book now on how corporations can atone for their participation in mass atrocity. And that actually led me a little bit down the rabbit hole that Marcus mentioned about the banks, the role of banks in especially Alexander Brown and Sons and the creation of investment banking to fund plantation agriculture. And I testified before Congress, and I argued that the banks should actually, one of the things I advocated for was 3 generations of free higher education. And there could be other things as well, housing grants and so on. But just yesterday, I spoke with the provost's office at Yale, who's done, I think, probably one of the most extraordinary responses to its history. They've been building out for the past 3 years. They've been researching the history of Yale and slavery, the connections. They've been transparent about that, what their findings are as they have been finding them. And then have created some really interesting local responses, which I can go into. But you can just look up Yale and slavery. You can see what they've been doing over the past few years. And I've been thinking of them as like, wow, that's actually a pretty astonishing model for corporations who are willing to do this work as well. And I absolutely agree with Marcus about Darity's work and others who have been at this for decades, that who we should be listening to.
So another question for both of you, and I think I might know the answer to this, but just to make sure that like clarification, I know that shipping and train transportation existed before these atrocities, right? It's not as if, shipping was created for this or trains were created for this. But I wonder if both of you can speak more about how both, the slavery system and the Nazis appropriated systems that were already in place to fulfill their purposes. I mean, like, was there, and you may not know the answer to this, but what was that process like?
Oh, I was just thinking about the book, The Mechanization Takes Command, and really how we were moving through towards kind of a dehumanizing technology in human civilization. We were developing these. It was not the first. I mean, when you look at the Namaharero genocide in Namibia, trains were used there as well. All right, so it was almost like a precursor to the Holocaust, and so I do want to acknowledge that and the role of trains prior to the Holocaust. And they're still working on. There's some lawsuits related to those railways as well. But in France specifically, and it was like horrifically convenient that the SNCF had been created just as the Germans marched in. And then they had a whole railway, and that meant they only had to take 6,000 engineers to tell 500,000 SNCF employees what to do. I mean, it's a really small number of people to manage and to help execute that. So that was already in place for them. I mean, and then the railways all worked together. They were able to use the SNCF rail cars in Romania. So all of these rail cars were moving all around. That's why you see the SNCF's name in most Holocaust museums in these photos, because even if it's Hungarians being deported, you're seeing an SNCF rail car. So, whatever makes things efficiency makes us more efficient at whatever we're doing. And if what we're doing is mass deportation and genocide, we're just really good at that.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Sarah. It's true, Danny, that global shipping existed before the slave trade, although not very long before it. So what I've argued is that a particular kind of deep sea sailing vessel, the European tall ship, was actually the most important machine in the rise of capitalism, not the steam engine, but the ship, which allowed the creation of the world market and the labor of sailors connected the various continents. Now, in this sense, the slave traders adapted pre-existing vessels to their purposes of trading in human beings. But it is also true that in the leading ports, especially Liverpool, a very specialized kind of vessel began to be built just for the slave trade. In other words, it had the maximal conditions or structures. It had a large lower deck to carry a large number of people. It had certain sailing characteristics. So it is true that the technology in this case followed the profit seeking in the slave trade. And I do think that it's interesting. Everybody used to say when there was a big debate about abolishing the slave trade, what would all those ships do? Well, some of them, they couldn't get the stench out of them. In other words, they had carried so many human passengers. Some of these same vessels would go on 10, 20 voyages. and some of those had to be scuttled, but a lot of others just entered trade in other routes. So the technology itself was flexible, but it was a very powerful part of this whole thing because the crisis of labor in the Americas, when it became clear that it was in many areas not going to be easy to enslave the indigenous people, that's when the Europeans began to look for available labor in Africa. And they devised an entire system that lasted for hundreds of years to make it all possible. And it was quite efficient. It was quite efficient. There was a whole science that grew up, medical science, for example, nautical archaeology, nautical shipbuilding to make this thing work. And so many different people stood to make money on it that it became a very lucrative enterprise. And that's, of course, one reason why it went on for so long.
Sarah, can I flip back to you then? There was the trains didn't have to be readapted, right, or refitted, right? They just used what was already in place. Would my understanding there be correct, or?
Yeah, so those so you'll see on the rail car something that says like 10 horses or 90 men or something. And that's from World War I, where actually they transported soldiers in these rail cars, and cattle and so on. So they were already being used, but the soldiers who were being transported in World War I were like 90, not 500 or 1,000, right? So it would have been horrible for those soldiers too. I mean, the level of discomfort, in prior generations would boggle our mind if we were transported back. So, and same for the animals. So whatever the heat and things that they were dealing with, would have been horrible too. So the rail cars were there. That's why it says like 90 men and 10 horses on it. Is from World War I. So they didn't have to readapt them. And these were used for transporting goods. And the idea also about the per head per kilometer, this is just part of industrialization. Everything was charged per head per kilometer. That was part of the dehumanization of our economic system, is that cows were transported, soldiers were transported per head per kilometer. So it wasn't like it was just representative of the larger dehumanization, not Jews specifically, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or homosexuals or whoever else they were deporting.
Danny, I want to point out we've got some really wonderful questions that have come in the Q&A. And so we'll loop back to this moment in our society in a moment. One of the questions that comes in is this: is there a good example of a company or companies outside of the US that have acknowledged their role in the New World slave trade? And what have they done? How have their governments reacted? And what can we learn from them?
Well, I think the city of Nantes, under a socialist mayor, erected a very impressive memorial to the victims of the slave trade. This happened in the 90s, early 2000s. A friend of mine, Françoise Vergès, historian, played a major role in this. But I think there are also very great limits as to what states or even regional governments are willing to do to acknowledge their own role in all of this. We see that even apologies have been slow to be forthcoming from states that really gained great profits from the slave trade and from the system of slavery. I noticed that more African countries are now creating memorials, but that's complicated too, because some groups cooperated with slave traders and some fought them. So my view is that there is a growing consciousness of the importance of memorializing the slave trade. Some very significant advances have been made, but there is still a great deal of resistance from above and from below. There are a lot of people in the United States who don't want to hear about this anymore. And if I may, I'll give you one example of, I've given, I don't know how many, 150 talks about the slave ship, that book. And almost in every meeting, someone will stand up in the back of the room and say, My family arrived in this country from Eastern Europe in 1910. They had nothing to do with it. So there's this great effort to escape any sense of responsibility. So what I always say is, why did your family immigrate? Was it because there were better jobs in the United States? Well, yes. How do you think there came to be better jobs in the United States? And of course, the massive accumulation of wealth based on the system of slavery was closely linked to that too. So I think one of the things we have to do is we need very broad educational campaigns so that people will understand all this. What scholars know now about the history of the slave trade and slavery is extraordinary. The civil rights movement and the Black Power movement demanded a new reckoning with the American past that took race and slavery seriously. Amazing work has been done on this, but there remains a tremendous gap between what scholars know and what the general public knows. And that is playing out right now in these culture wars around education. So in my view, if we're ever going to have proper engagement and acknowledgement, it's going to take a very broad educational campaign.
In Europe, The Guardian has done some impressive work. So they've actually can look up, they've actually, some of their founding money came from people who owned plantations in the Caribbean. And so now they actually have a restorative team that's gone to see where those plantations were. They're now hiring journalists there to do more coverage. They have a big statement. So they're modeling, of course, they're a truth organization because they're a news organization. Lloyd's of London has dipped its toe in. Bank of England is like sort of trying. But so you see it a little bit. It's a little bit easier to dodge it in Europe because it didn't happen on the land there. So they have that sort of like, Liverpool was born because of cotton, but like, you can't see it.
Another question, it's question/comment. There were moments in your talks where it felt like you gave agency, in quotes, to the ships and trains themselves, though they were just the means to accomplish the goal of enslavement, forced labor, and annihilation. Does it matter what means of transportation were used?
Well, historically, it matters a great deal. And perhaps I summarized too easily, but if you'll read the book, The Slave Ship of Human History, you'll see that the agency resides in the organizers of the slave trade and the people who carried it out. The vessels themselves are instruments. They are mere instruments, but they are horrific instruments with great social meaning. So again, who did what to whom with what consequences? I think that's the key question.
Yeah. It's only one driver refused to drive a train in France. And it was only a train of German soldiers, like that was in a French train, but filled with German soldiers. And nothing happened to him. He got sent to he got sent to a different location, but he wasn't shot. But no one else stopped the trains. And so I think it matters historically, as Marcus said. Also, like, those train drivers, more of them could have done something different. We saw those airlines say no. And the saying no makes a big difference. And we'll see what happens with these mass deportations and as families are torn apart. Like, I think it makes visible the role that we can all find ourselves playing in surprising ways. Like, no train driver signed up to, I think, work for the SNCF so they could take people to death centers, right? They just found themselves there. So I think for me, it made me realize, like, what role do I have in all of these things?
This question comes from also the chat. The question of conscience on the part of the government, cooperation, community, and individual link are all essential to the topic of discrimination to the extent of extermination of people. What are your recommendations for citizens as we confront yet another targeting of a particular group for discrimination?
The main thing I thought of recently is I saw some people were turning over illegal immigrants to ICE right now. Like, there was some of that happening. And it was reminding me, in France, when the Germans came in, they received 300,000 letters of denunciation of their Jewish neighbors, even though there weren't even 300,000 Jews in France at the time. That's how many. And the Germans actually said, stop sending the letters. We know where they all are. And just the kind of complicit, like the way that people can't wait to like turn people in. Like, I think resisting this sort of like, oh, I'm going to get in good with this administration by helping it out in some way, or that's sort of on my mind, that particular statistic from France.
Yeah, I think that very local mobilizations in defense of neighbors and friends is a very important thing to do. I also think that we may be poised on the edge of one of the greatest extended moments of civil disobedience this country has ever seen. I think we still need to think about how you move from civil disobedience to other kinds of action. And I think that, but I think that a lot of that will happen under pressure. I'd also add that if it is true that the armed forces will be used in the forced deportations, it should be remembered that protesters against the war in Vietnam, organizers against the Vietnam War, did a great deal of work among soldiers with tremendous impact, and that you can actually see the decline of the American adventure in Vietnam by the number of peace signs that are on the helmets of soldiers. That a large part of the American ability to wage that war was subverted from within the military by young people who didn't really want to be part of it. So I do think that conversations with soldiers and others who are tasked with carrying out the deportations could be extremely valuable.
Danny, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just want to once again thank Sarah and Marcus for participating, Laura for the KHC hosting, and for all our attendance. I know there were many other questions that we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but it's been a very informative presentation. I have pages of notes that I need to decipher. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation and involvement.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great working with you.
Yeah,
thank
really interesting to connect those.
Sarah and Marcus and Danny, thank you so much. And just to reflect on Danny's last remarks, it's been really eye-opening. And as we're at the precipice of this massive change potentially in our society going forward, really understanding how different communities are in crisis now, and the pain, but also the ability to come together as community and really forge those bonds will become even more important. And so having conversations like this where we can see these different intersections, or as a program that Danny and I are participating at Queensborough called Unseen Threads, where it's not about comparison, but it's about holding multiple things to be true, multiple pains to be true, and multiple realities to be true, so that we can come together as a nation and hopefully come out of this next chapter more stronger than we are going in. So on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, thank you all very, very much for attending. And Marcus, Sarah, and Danny, thank you. And a shout out to Barana Soman, the KHC's administrative coordinator, who's facilitating everything in the background. Thank you all. Stay safe. Be well.